Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Nick Kavas, Policy Lead at FinTech Australia. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we meet today and to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people present today. I'm delighted to be moderating this web panel discussion today on action initiation and the future of the consumer data right. I think it's safe to say action initiation under the consumer data right has been more hotly anticipated than the new Taylor Swift album. It's been described as something that will unlock the real magic of the CDR. So rather than just facilitating data sharing, which is the existing framework we have, with CDR action initiation, consumers will eventually be able to instruct actions. So this might be opening or closing an account, switching, changing your details, or making a payment. It opens up a world of new use cases for consumers and makes the CDR a far more enticing proposition. The government has now consulted on draft legislation to implement action initiation, and we expect this to be introduced into Parliament imminently, maybe later this month or maybe early next year, but it's definitely on its way. So with all this excitement, we've teamed up with Editree to give you an introduction to the what, the why, and how of action initiation. But even if you're familiar with action initiation, our panel will also be exploring the finer details of what to expect with this exciting new legislation and how we think it might come to life. Before we get into it, I'll quickly introduce each of our four fantastic panelists. So first up, we have Dr. Scott Farrell. Scott is the senior partner at King Wood & Mallesons with more than 25 years experience in the law of financial markets, systems and technology. Now, if the government's launching a review and inquiry in the financial services space, Scott is probably odds-on favourite to be leading it. Some of his recent greatest hits include two of the inquiries for the government, which designed and developed the framework for the CDR, and he also chaired the review for the regulatory architecture of Australia's payment system. Welcome, Scott. Second panellist is Darcy Malomfi. Aside from having a fantastic name, he's also the compliance and policy lead at Editree. Through his role at Editree, Darcy is working to build a vibrant digital economy by assisting more businesses to become integrated with the CDR. And Darcy also worked closely with Scott on the CDR Future Directions report in his previous role at Treasury, which of course considered and recommended action initiation. Welcome, Darcy. Third up, we have Brett Watson. Brett is a partner in KPMG's financial services practice and leads the open banking and payments teams. Brett has over 25 years experience in transaction banking, payments, and open banking, and also has consulted extensively across the CDR ecosystem for banks, schemes, aggregators, fintechs, and more recently with the expansion to telecommunications and energy providers. Welcome, Brett. And leaving the best for last, we have Claire McFarlane, executive for product at iSelect. Claire leads iSelect's product and experience design teams, and through this role, Claire has a strong focus on driving innovation in the comparator market via customer-led product delivery. And prior to joining iSelect, Claire was head of digital for the retail division at AGL and previously held senior management roles in telecommunications, digital marketing, and consulting. Thank you to all our panelists for joining us today. Before we kick off with some questions, to housekeeping, we'll try to have maybe 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A at the end. Please, if you can use the Q&A function through Zoom, write in your questions throughout the discussion, and we'll try to pick out a few. If we have time, we'll ask our panelists at the end. Okay, let's get into it. First, we're going to go through action initiation basics. What is it? What new opportunities will it unlock? And I think it's fitting to kick off this one with Scott, who's been called by some the godfather or the father of CDR. Scott, can you take us through what action initiation is?
Well, you did a pretty good job yourself there, Nick, of describing what it is, but there's probably three different ways you could describe it, depending on the kind of language that you are used to hearing. One of them is it's allowing the sharing of instructional and not just declarative information. So information that can do stuff as opposed to information that just says the stuff that's already been done. That's obviously not the one that we would say to people who are trying to get their head around CDR the first time. If you're trying to get head around CDR the first time, it'd be, you know how the CDR is a new highway that allows you to get people to send data to other people about you? Well, this allows you to send the trucks the other way and get people to do things on your behalf using the highway. And the last one to do it, if you've got a slightly legal bent or you have some interaction with this in the real world, it's just a digital power of attorney. It's an authority that you give to someone to do something on your behalf using the digital infrastructure, which is national digital infrastructure of the CDR. So that would be how I describe the what. But of course, Nick, that doesn't really describe the why. Did you want me to do the why, Nick? I can if you like.
Yeah. Please tell us the why.
Okay, mate. I was setting you up there. Now I've got to answer my own question. So the why is really, really important, because the why is not just because Britain and Europe have it for payments, right? Because it is so much broader in Australia, because our CDR is not just about payment accounts. You know, we haven't got a PSD2, we've got a CDR. It doesn't even have a P in it. So it goes much, much broader than just payments. And really the answer is from the 4 words which have been on the front cover of my first 2 reviews for our government. The first word is customers. And this is because CDR action initiation is an incredible digital inclusion tool. It means that people can be involved in getting benefits from our digital economy, even if they're not super clever at dealing with digital stuff, because here is a safe way of getting other people you trust to do things on your behalf in the digital world. So when I say digital inclusion, I don't mean financial inclusion, because there is a difference between those who are digitally excluded and financially excluded. Many people who you would think would be financially included are seriously digitally excluded, because not all of us can actually deal with this stuff. The second is choice. It allows a whole lot of better choices to be made, because applications or information that allow you to get better choices can be done on your behalf. You're not just getting raw data. You could actually get meaningful information if people can actually submit things on your behalf. The next one is convenience, which here it is. Look, I don't want you to just tell me what the best deal is. Could you move me on to the best deal, please? And then tomorrow, move me on to the next one, and the next one, and the next one, because I'm too busy to deal with this stuff, and I would like someone to do it for me. And the last one is confidence. And this is really, it gets more important all of the time. The CDR is built to be a secure and safe system, certainly much more secure and safe than what people might be using right now to share their data. And so when we come to interacting more deeply with the digital world, this is about allowing Australians to appoint someone, to get someone to do their digital stuff that they know they can trust, not only the person, but the system that is looking after them when the person does their stuff to them. So if you really want to know the why, in my view, you go straight to the front cover of either of my 2 reviews, because that ended up always being the themes that I was applying in designing this stuff.
Thanks, Scott. Glad you brought out the truck and highway analogy as well. My turn to Darcy, just building on Scott's comments. In terms of the design, so this proposed legislation the government's consulted on recently, how does this new stage of action initiation fit in with the existing CDR framework we have for data sharing?
Yeah, so I think that data sharing and action initiation work together really, really well, because if we think about it, you know, it's very good to be able to have access to my data, but what I really want is to have the ability to kind of work with it and to be able to do something. So if we think about something like a personal financial management tool, it's great to be able to see all my details in one place, but what would be even better is if I could, you know, automatically have all of my accounts arranged in the way that's going to maximize my savings returns. Like, that's the kind of thing that I think we're thinking about by marrying CDR data sharing with action initiation. I think from a kind of framework design perspective as well, the 2 go together really, really well, because as Scott mentioned, it's largely about the communication of information in those kind of instructions. So what it looks like the government has done is they're expanding on the existing infrastructure, which has been put in place for data sharing, being that the legislative infrastructure, as well as more of the kind of technical controls, in an attempt to make sure that we're building on an existing system rather than building something which is entirely new. And I think that's an important thing to think about, is this is the natural kind of growth and expansion of what the CDR is. It's not something which is going to be an entirely new framework. It's building on what we have.
Thanks, Darcy. And something pretty core to the design that I think seems a bit intimidating or complex or difficult to understand that kind of underpins what's being proposed. There's this concept of the instruction layer versus the action layer. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the difference is there, and maybe a practical example of what the difference is between those two things?
Yeah, I can have a go. So if we think about it in one way, you can think about in the payment system, there's the payment initiation process, and then there's the payment clearing process. And the payment initiation process is saying you'd like to initiate a payment, but once that request has been received, there's a whole bunch of steps that are actually taken by the bank before they're willing to move the funds. So that's how you can think of the difference between the action initiation phase, the initiating, versus the actual action phase where the actions are being undertaken. If you want a crude to the point of borderline offensive example, imagine that my bank has all my personal details just kind of kept on a whiteboard in a locked room. Action initiation would allow someone to go up and say to the bank, we'd like to change the details that you have on that whiteboard. It wouldn't mean, though, that you can enter into that room, because that's part of the action layer. So it's all about the communication between these participants to instruct them to take action. It's not kind of working into those existing action systems to dictate how those actions have to be undertaken. Scott, you have your hand up.
Yes, Scott.
And I just wanted to add something. For those of you who are very familiar with how this might be put into place in the European Union or the United Kingdom, that's a bit different, right? Because when you are building something which needs to cover across a whole range of parts of the economy, you do need to distinguish between the actual instruction layer and the action layer, because you can't integrate the entire system, for example, just into payments and then expect to be able to make it work for energy. So this is where, because we have a broader system, we can't actually follow the architecture of other countries who are focused only on initiating payments.
Scott, just to follow on from your previous comments, already kind of covered the why, and probably some of the ideas you pitched in that Future Directions report from a couple of years ago, which originally recommended action initiation and is now being implemented by the government. Since that, I suppose those original, whys, the original intention behind it, has anything changed since then? And also, some naysayers might say, are we mature enough with the existing CDR framework to go down this path now, and is it the right time to expand to action initiation? Yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, there's an assumption in that comment that we could do it in 24 hours. And there's also an assumption in that comment that if we delay, we'll be able to do it in 18 to 24 months, but maybe we won't. I can tell you one thing, though, that we simply cannot do it unless we build the foundations to allow us to make that choice later of when we make it live. And it takes time. We've learned that from the previous experience. We are required to do multiple things at once to get this to work. But just because you're building the foundations doesn't mean that you're going to be opening the door of the building the very next day. This is a hyper-changing environment. My belief is we need a safe system for doing this. My belief is we don't have that at present. My belief is that if we don't do it, Australians will find another way of doing it which won't be as good. So we should start building the foundations. We might need to think very carefully about risks involved, but one of the biggest risks involved is to not have anything to work from at all. So I don't accept that those comments mean that the status quo of having nothing is safer than working towards building something that's better.
Thanks, Scott. Yeah, definitely not something that happens overnight either. And I think later in the conversation, we'll discuss sort of next steps and where to from here. But I might turn, for now, we'll focus on sort of the design. Claire and Brett, in terms of the existing framework we have and CDR data sharing, how can that existing data sharing framework work in unison with or improve and augment these emerging action initiation services that are likely to come about, or how does action initiation, on the other hand, improve the existing data sharing we have and ensure consumers start engaging with that? I might start with you, Claire, if you're...
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Nick. So look, from my perspective, sort of at iSelect, where we're comparing a bunch of different products and services across different verticals, I guess we see the two being sort of two parts of a whole, so to speak, so very complementary. So we're sort of looking forward to a new comparison model where auto comparison runs based on that sort of product and usage data. So that's all of the data sharing capability. But to make a decision or take an action off that data and get a customer a better deal, we sort of require that action initiation extension. So it's kind of acting on the insights that we would hope to generate for a customer. So very much complementary and building a foundation that enables us to sort of deliver value from a sort of switch and save perspective. Brett?
Yes, thanks, Claire. And Nick, I think for me, you kind of almost said it in your opening. I think action initiation really allows the bringing to life of the CDR for me. You know, I think there are some fantastic use cases. I mean, if you think about a personal financial management app or a business financial management app where you know, right now, the ability to consolidate all of your financial holdings across multiple entities into one place gives you some great insight. But then if you wanted to, say, move some money around in that, you can't, right? Because you can't. So, you know, the ability to, say, easily initiate payments around that through an action, or to say, actually, I'll close one account and open another one, where I can see a better deal, you know, those things really just greatly enhance that customer experience. So I think for me, whether it's the kind of service that Claire's talking about or some of these other ones, I think the action initiation for me is the thing that's really going to bring the CDR to life and bring those great customer experiences that everybody wants to see.
Thanks, Brett. Let's talk a bit more about the use cases. Darcy, might turn to you. Often action initiation kind of gets associated quite closely with payments. That's kind of the use case a lot of people immediately sort of jump to or expect might be first cab off the rank. But what other kinds of services will action initiation enable? I know AdaTree's done a lot of deep thinking and work on this. You have a few research reports looking at some pretty interesting use cases. And also, even what do you think the prioritization as the government sort of works their way through a few of these use cases, how they'll be prioritized as they get rolled out, or the minister starts designating them or declaring them?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because ultimately the consumer is the one who will be receiving the services. So what's really important is that whatever comes to market is going to be what's most beneficial for them. I think what action initiation is going to have to do to facilitate that then is to really think about what actions need to be kind of brought into the system first in order to really demonstrate that consumer use case. From the information which it looks like is being provided by government through things like the additional material on the legislation, I think it does seem like there's quite a big focus on the payment side of things. But the other thing which looks like it's quite a large focus is on switching and making the management of an account easier. So that can include things like a process to apply for a new account with a provider with whom you don't have an existing relationship, or applying for a new product which is going to give you a better interest rate. It looks like there's quite a large focus on all of those things which are taking away the kind of, I'm going to say, the tedious manual work which is normally required from a consumer to actually act on the information they're provided. And so from, I suppose, my perspective, what's going to be really important is making sure that the way in which the actions are brought in is going to maximize those benefits to consumer by facilitating those use cases earliest. And I do think that, you know, two of the biggest ones are likely to be in relation to payment initiation, but also in relation to switching and account management. So those are the two that I think I'm most eager to see come to life soonest.
Thanks, Darcy. Claire, Darcy briefly mentioned it there, but in Scott's Future Directions report, there's a whole chapter on switching and the consumer data right. what do you think the real opportunity is for consumers with switching, with action initiation happening, and what are you excited about, particularly from an iSelect perspective?
Yeah, so I think from a consumer perspective, what CDR and data sharing and action initiation kind of enable in the future is really, I guess, a step change in the comparison model. So if you look at how, you know, cost of living pressures today, everyone's trying to sort of save money. We know energy prices will continue to increase, and, you know, for a customer today to kind of compare an energy provider, what the deal they're on with another retailer, it's actually quite confusing and complex. So they might have to get their bill, identify certain data points on their bill. They might open up a bunch of tabs and kind of browse across different retailers to get a sense of how much they might save if they switched. If they use a service like iSelect, they'll generally do sort of a browse, put in their needs on the website, get to a sort of page where they kind of get a feel for how much they might save, and then typically they'll end up on a phone call probably for up to an hour, again inputting manual data points for a really experienced agent to be able to help them understand the potential savings. So, you know, Darcy mentioned tedious and manual. It's also very complex and confusing for a lot of customers to understand the type of savings they will get by switching providers. So I think, you know, the promise is really a step change in that experience. So through automation, through real product data, real usage data, the customer has the potential to understand the real savings they will achieve if they were to switch. So that's significant. So that sort of always on auto comparison can generate a lot of reduce a lot of effort from a customer perspective. And then we sort of move to the action initiation change where, you know, not only can, you know, a certain provider such as iSelect kind of run that always on comparison, but then they can switch on your behalf. So that can kind of run continuously. So from a comparison and switching perspective, it kind of takes the complexity out of it for the customer. And hopefully enables them to use their time to do things they'd rather do with their time, not their life admin, and, you know, generally save more money. So yeah, that's the kind of vision we see coming through for that new comparison model enabled by CDR.
Thanks, Claire. Those are some really good insights on yeah, the potential for switching. My turn to Brett. This is a bit of a tricky one, and something that I think has been a hot topic of conversation, particularly among FinTech Australia members, as we were sort of reviewing the draft legislation and looking to the future. And from the look of our Q&A section, there's already a few questions along these lines, so I might go straight to it. But the interaction between Pay2 and CDR payment initiation has been hotly sort of debated, and people often ask if Pay2 is different to the CDR, will it compete with it, or will it complement it and augment it? So Brett, how will the existing payment rails under the NPP interact with CDR, and what does that sort of overlay between the two look like?
Yeah, Nick, thanks, and I'll have a go at answering this question, but I'm sure Scott will have a point of view that might add some value to this as well. But I mean, and I guess there's a little bit of confusion about this, perhaps. I mean, but Pay2 is a new offering currently being rolled out by, you know, the NPP and its members that allow, you know, third parties to initiate payments. So, you know, when Scott and his crew looked at how to support payments, you know, they talked about aligning closely with, you know, new investment and sort of the roadmap for payments in Australia. And if you look at Pay2 and the fact that it is initiating third-party payments, it looks like a good way of bringing payments to life inside the CDR. And it's been built in a way that is broad in scope, you know, supports use cases from sort of e-com and in-app, recurring direct debits, one-off payments. It kind of is built to support a broad range of transactions, and it's scalable and it's safe, right? It has a mechanism in there that requires a sort of a validation back in your banking app that you want to make that payment. So it's been designed in a way that's meant to be safe for third-party payment initiation. So, you know, whilst the paper that, you know, whilst there's no mandate in terms of the way in which we should bring payments to life in CDR, it looks to make sense that, you know, aligning it with Pay2 and what's being done there. Now, the rollout of Pay2 is still happening. It's early. You know, there are some people that have been falling a little bit behind on that roadmap, but you know, that does look like the way, the best way to bring payments to life, but it may not be the only way, and we, you know, we'll see that as it evolves. But Scott, did you sort of want to perhaps add anything to that?
Sure, thanks, Brett. And this is another area where it's important to understand the context of CDR as being economy-wide. Every single time we have the application of action initiation in a new sector, it is entirely sensible to look super closely at how the action layer is already operated in that sector. The same may happen for energy, the same may happen for telecommunications and everything else. It would be astonishingly inefficient to just ignore what was already there and ask everyone to build another thing. So in this particular case, if this infrastructure, this system, which allows actions to be taken, works pretty well, if it works pretty well, that's an if, but you know, we can work on that if, then why shouldn't you enable those we are going to require follow these instructions to choose to use something that does it, that they've already built? Or another, to go back to my highway analogy and say that the roads are going to towns which are different sectors. Each time you build an off-ramp from the highway to that town, there are two things that we need to consider. One, the regulation in that place, i.e. payments regulation, how do we fit in with that? And the other is the technology in that place. And it might be that Pay2 has already started building the off-ramp from their side, which means that the CDR building might be a little easier. But exactly as Brett said, maybe that is the answer now. It might not be the answer in 10 years' time. And we might need to have multiple opportunities. So I think it's a question of what works best to achieve the outcomes for consumers without imposing additional obligations on the data holders that we actually don't need to achieve those outcomes for consumers.
One of the things that I might add to this as well is on top of I think the key thing to always remember in this kind of thing is that these are ultimately to deliver consumer services. And I do think there's going to be a huge opportunity for, you know, data sharing to feed into Pay2 services as well. So I think one thing that I would be really keen to see is a consciousness of how the consumer will be experiencing the two systems kind of working together, just to make sure that in implementation, there isn't some weird dichotomy where I have to go through one whole process to share my CDR data, and then through an entirely separate process to set up a payment instruction, and then possibly an entirely separate other process to do something else. I think making sure that there are sensible and kind of appropriate protections in place is very important. And it's also important from my perspective that all of these are working together to provide that good consumer experience. And I think interoperability between systems is something which is really kind of vital to be thinking about at this early stage in the implementation of action initiation.
Just continue along the lines of sort of, the most streamlined, frictionless consumer experience possible. Something, and this has become, with recent events, I won't say the O word, but the issue of digital identity has become even more of a sort of hot topic. Maybe one for Darcy or for Scott. How do you think identity should play a part or fit in with how action initiation works, particularly when we're talking about opening accounts and switching use cases?
Do you want to go first, Scott, or shall I?
Yeah, he said your name first, Darcy. That means you have to go first.
Fair enough. So one thing which I do think action initiation is going to be introducing, which to this point hasn't been part of CDR, is the ability to engage with a service provider with whom you don't actually have an existing relationship. And that's, I think, super important for making switching effective and streamlined. So one thing that I'm really keen to see is consideration be put into how you can make sure that that process is going to be facilitated in a way that provides a great user experience using emerging, both, I suppose, government or industry initiatives for consumer identification purposes. Because nothing would be worse than having an automated switching process, which every time they try to switch, you have to go through a new, very manual process to email in 100 points of ID or something along those lines. I think there's also a question about how the CDR can be used to limit the need to be sharing excessive pieces of consumer detail in order to prove aspects about yourself. And I think that's something which CDR data sharing could also kind of largely already be facilitating. So if I think about the kind of information that I have to provide to, say, a rental service to prove that I can pay my income or prove my rent, they have a lot of information that they require, like my pay slips and my transaction details and all that kind of additional information, which realistically, I don't think I should need to share. And I think CDR and CDR Insights provide a good opportunity to say, you know, can Darcy pay his rent? Yes or no? And is this an appropriate product to receive? But I'll throw it to you, Scott, because I'm keen to hear your views on this as well.
I think the CDR was going to present the positive use case, the positive reason that for us to properly engage with interoperable or consistent digital identification. Much of the reasoning for digital identification so far has been defensive, and that is important, but it's harder to get people to invest in defensive. It will certainly produce that benefit, but the use of the CDR is going to end up one way or another with us having a workable method of digitally identifying ourselves, just because of what Darcy said. So it is time for work out, right, well, just like I've just said around payments, are we going to build an identification infrastructure that can work with CDR, or are we going to effectively build it within CDR because that's the way it's going to arise? But I think what is really powerful is the fact that because of the frictions that Darcy has mentioned, and they're genuine frictions. I mean, it's quite, no one wants to send photocopies of their license somewhere, right? Especially now, because those frictions will need to be removed. We will end up with digital identification one way or another. My view is we should be doing it on the basis of conscious choice, just like we did with CDR, and just like we do with other important, valuable information transfer systems. So I think it is the inflection point for where we're going to get a better system. Quite frankly, whether we like it or not, this is going to mean that we will have to have one.
Just building on some of the points, this is open to everyone, building on some of the points made there around digital identification. The recent high-profile data breaches, do we think that that's a risk or something that's going to hold back the CDR and action initiation, or is it really an opportunity to sort of showcase, you know, the consumer trust and confidence, you know, being one of the key design features underpinning the CDR and all of the safeguards that we have within the CDR? Maybe start with Darcy.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, the CDR offers a really powerful alternative to a lot of existing data sharing processes. And I think that the fact that it is a regulated ecosystem between accredited people on one side and your service providers on the other is intended to provide that more consumer choice, confidence, and convenience. Were those the four, Scott? Focused approach.
Yeah, mate, you got it.
Good. I'm glad I got the four. Approach to data sharing than a lot of the existing processes. And I think that one of the things which CDR does one of the things which I think is quite important about CDR is that it is based very heavily on that idea of consumer consent and consumer understanding of how their data will be used, both during the consented period, as well as after the consented period, where it will either have to be deleted, de-identified, or retained because there's some other regulation which requires it to be retained. I think the consent flow, though not perfect, it does a good job of improving consumer confidence. But I think, Claire, you mentioned earlier that you'd had some experience with it as well.
Yeah, so we've been, thanks, Darcy, been, you know, as part of our Open Energy MVP that we've been designing and building, we obviously take that to customers and iteratively gather feedback. So certainly the onboarding and consent flow was something we were really, really focused on. My initial I guess, thoughts or concerns from a product adoption perspective were that flow is quite lengthy, and there's obviously a lot of information for the consumer to, you know, understand and then opt into all of the different data sets and really be very upfront and transparent about the data that's being shared. But conversely, it sort of created you know, the feedback we received from customers that participated in testing was that it did actually create a sense of trust and transparency. So I think there's a big opportunity. Obviously, always it's in how you communicate the benefits to the customer through those different touch points. But from, you know, the feedback we're getting, I would say there's a big opportunity to build trust through CDR and explain to customers how data is being used and shared. And that is what people will be looking for.
Could I add something to that, Nick? If I can answer this just by reference to another analogy, because that's always the safest way to answer these sorts of things. I really would prefer to be swimming at a beach with the red and yellow flags rather than one without the red and yellow flags. I understand it's still the ocean, but if there's lifeguards and lifesavers watching the beach, I feel a bit safer and I'm swimming in the right point because professionals have told me where I should be swimming. Applies to data just as much as it does the surf. And the CDR, as I've said before, are the red and yellow flags, and most of the other people on this call, they're lifeguards.
Thanks, everyone. Might turn to you now, Brett. I think, you know, through this discussion of, we'll get away from the tricky topics. Let's go back to the use cases. But based on some of the use cases we've sort of discussed, it seems like there's a whole lot of new business opportunities here, particularly for fintechs. But who do you think action initiation is a big opportunity for, but also who is it a bit of a threat for, or who might perceive it as a threat?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and I'm sure there'll be lots of views on the panel on this one as well. But look, I can see action initiation as an opportunity to enhance offers, not only for fintechs, but also, you know, challenges and incumbents across a range of industries, right? Particularly with, you know, switching getting easier. And I mean, I think it's going to be a threat to any organization that really is lazy when it comes to sort of understanding their customers or have complex and or expensive sort of products. I think that, you know, if you look at Claire's example with her, you know, energy switching, I think if switching an energy provider becomes as easy as clicking yes, I think you want to make sure your customers are on the right products, you know, and that those products are competitive, easy to understand, they got simple T's and C's, all of those sort of things. So if you're not doing those sort of things, then I think, you know, any of the challenges or incumbents are there to pick you off. I mean, this is what the system allows them to do. So I think it's going to be a threat to anyone who thinks they can just sit back and not act and so, as I said, is lazy with customers. I don't know if Scott or anyone wants to add to that, but you know, that's how I see it.
Yeah, I'd agree, Brett. I think, you know, brands that sort of benefit from that. I mean, there's a lot of barriers to customers making a decision to change a product or service. There's a whole range of kind of behavioural economics reasons around why they may or may not do that at a point in time. But brands that have potentially benefited off that kind of lack of proactive decision making from customers, I think that, yeah, I would agree that's a threat. I think the opportunity is really for those brands or companies that can leverage product data and insights to create customer value and products off the back of the data that's enabled. I think those brands that can innovate in this space, which is not always easy either, sort of probably will experience the benefits.
Yep, absolutely.
That's a great point, Claire, because we shouldn't assume that everyone out there who's running a business that is not potentially using the data properly or as effectively for the customers is because they didn't want to. It might be because they didn't have the impetus to do so. Maybe they couldn't get funding from the board, or we just don't know. But this will provide an impetus for more Australian businesses to get match fit because it does become more competitive. So it might actually be a huge benefit for some organisations that were waiting for the opportunity to make this sort of investment. And from the customer's perspective, it doesn't really matter who is improving the services to them as long as they're improving. So I'm really hoping that a lot of entities that we would call, inverted commas, incumbents, inverted commas, actually start to prove that they're not incumbents they're incumbents for a good reason and that they can respond to customer demand. So I agree totally, and it could come from anywhere in our economy.
Yeah, and I like that match fit terms, Scott. I think, you know, that's really what it's about, right? I mean, it's about getting match fit and ensuring that you understand your customers and you're adding value. So no, I think it's a really nice way to think about it.
Another cool way that you can think about it, kind of providing opportunities, is I think it gives people a better opportunity to focus on what it is they want to specialize in. So it might be that you specialize very heavily in the action layer, but your consumer experience flow is actually entirely outsourced through things like action initiation. Or it might be that what you specialize in is actually providing that really great consumer experience, and then they can bring their own kind of service provider to just work in the background. I'd be really excited to see how this impacts what people see as being the most important thing for actually driving forward their products, and where they think that they can actually have that competitive edge. So I'll be really, really keen to see it when it comes along.
And that's, if you go back to the green book, the second review, the green book, that's what we had in mind in relation to the ecosystem. A complex system where people are performing specialized tasks. We have one of those already. It's called a financial system, but it would be nice to generate that kind of innovation, not just in other people's money, but in other people's data within a safe system that allows the right people to do the best job that they can for their customers.
And Scott, I think perhaps the other point that I think is making here is just that perhaps some of the different types of relationships we might see evolve between different, getting sort of to Darcy's point, between, you know, fintechs and some incumbents and others that are choosing to play specific roles, and new types of partnerships building that ecosystem out. I think that's something that we're also going to see, and it's, again, for incumbents, it's going to be important to start thinking about, you know, how they want to play in that ecosystem and the role, and who they might partner with, you know, to add value in that as well.
Yeah, and so, yeah, getting match fit doesn't mean you're playing alone. It's getting match fit as a team, because I don't think there's very many Australian companies that can do this on their own and do it as well as the right team could.
Yeah, I think we had a lot of good sort of framing of the reasons to motivate or sort of get some of the incumbents to get involved with it or get match fit. But Darcy might call on you for this one, but a bit of an extreme practical example of what if an incumbent, say a bank, doesn't want to enable third parties to, say, initiate payments or instruct an account opening? Can they just opt out of action initiation or ignore an instruction? What happens then?
Yeah, so fundamentally, in the same way that the data sharing is a consumer data right, this is a right for consumers to be able to access and use services in a new way. So if you are one of the people who has to provide a service or who has to be kind of declared to provide action initiation, you're not allowed to discriminate against an action just because you received it through the CDR. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to willy-nilly kind of guess everything that comes to you. So if you get a payment request asking for you to send $10,000 from an offshore bank account, you're allowed to go through the general processes that you would to ensure that that is going to be a legitimate payment. But you can't just deny an action request because it came through the CDR. The intention behind this is to make sure that consumers are, you know, fundamentally in control, and consumers do have the ability to access the services in the way that's best for them. And it is, again, tying back to that idea that it is a consumer right. So yeah, you can't just say that you won't do an action, no. Scott?
If I just add to that, like, you can't kind of say no in the real world either, because if you've appointed someone to act on your behalf because maybe there's a reason you can't act, you know, lawyers do that, and when we are appointed in that role, we are the person, and we're their representative. So if you say no to the representative, you're saying no to the customer, and you probably can't because that's your contract. So when people worry about this, they need to understand that in the real world context, this exists now because it's necessary to be able to appoint others to act on your behalf in real life. There's all sorts of reasons. All this is doing the same thing, in the sense of, if I rock up and say, I've got to look after my mother's bank account and here's her power of attorney, if the bank says, no, you can't, and as a result, we can't pay mum's mortgage, that's a bad thing. And so we have a system of rules and laws that already allows this to happen. This is merely carrying them across into digital world. Darcy's dead right, though. It's a right of an individual to say, I just need someone else to look after me. Please listen to them because I've pointed them through a government framework which says they're properly authorised.
Thanks, Scott. We might sort of finish up this discussion before we go into the Q&A with a final sort of where to from here from you, Scott. So what still needs to happen before action initiation is actually fully operational? The government agreed to your recommendation, and now we have the draft legislation, but where to from here, and how long could we expect it to take before we, in there pushing buttons and opening accounts, etc.?
It's not going to happen by this Christmas, because, and quite rightly, right? So the more important the stuff you're dealing with, the kind of the longer it takes. So we've got to have a law passed, which has been released in draft form. We've got to have rules put into place. We've got to choose what is the first action that we'll be dealing with, and we need standards in place. All of those things, once a law is passed, are going to be done in consultation and working through what is needed for industry. We can't really just take what was done in another place, because quite frankly, payments aren't the same in another place, for example, and you won't expect any other industry to be the same in any other country. So we're going to have to work through this together. Quite rightly, we have changed how we have done this through CDR over the last 3 years. And so this will be an iterative process too. I think it needs to be, so that we can keep correcting and adjusting if we find better ways of doing things. My personal view, completely ill-informed, is we're going to spend most of next year working through all of that. And my experience in dealing with building large payment systems or large clearing systems is it does take time for a very good reason, because this time we're not only dealing with other people's information, we're dealing with the ability to change their lives. And so we do need to make sure it is the safe red and yellow flags, and not sort of fake flags in some kind of way. But when I say that, it doesn't mean everyone can sort of hang back until next year sometime, because we only get to getting most of the work done next year if we start doing it now. And if you're wondering why would we do that, is because this is for your customers. That, in my world, that's kind of the answer to most things.
Thanks, Scott. Yeah, definitely. I think a common sort of misunderstanding since legislation came out, that it's just, this is enabling legislation, and most of the the difficult decisions and the hard work will be through the delegated legislation. But also that means there'll be a lot of in-depth consultation, specific consultation for specific sectors, specific action types, as those are being rolled out. So it's not sort of, this has gone into Parliament, might pass quickly, and then it's all done and dusted. It'll take a while, but that's also good as well. Everyone will have the chance to give their views on what to prioritize, what will work well and what won't. So should be an interesting year ahead of us.
And we're all counting on everyone on this call to actually put their thoughts into the mix and put their expertise in. We're only a small country, right? We can't actually do this with just a subset of us like other countries can. So if you're on this call and you can see me, please help make this work, because I'm betting that you're a lifesaver in this context, and we need all of you to teach us where to put the flags this time.
Awesome, thanks everyone. Let's we'll quickly switch to Q&A. We've had quite a few questions, so apologies to people if we don't get to your question. I'll try and group them as well, because there's been a little bit of overlap with some of the themes, I think, coming from some of the topics discussed. So the first one, or something that's come up in a couple of questions here, is around digital identity. I suppose, firstly, why wouldn't sort of the GovID digital identity just be brought in or integrated as a single source of truth? And also people saying that it seems like digital identity is a long way off from being, that issue is a long way from being solved, and could delays with that actually stall the rollout of action initiation, or particularly some of those use cases that are aligned on it? Or is it something that will eventually happen simultaneously? Any sort of thoughts on those sort of two pathways and how they overlap? Maybe Darcy.
Am I going to go first on? I'll go first this time, Darcy, because you went first last time. My personal view is a digital identification framework for Australians needs to be one that they choose to use, rather than ones that they have imposed on them. Both of my reports have referred to digital identification, and the future directions did as well. I think we need to be building a framework for recognition of digital identification systems so they work within CDR. But I think there can be lots of innovation and lots of different offerings within a safe framework, so it's not stuck in time. Individual service providers, for example, the Australian government is a service provider to us. They can have their own frameworks which allow us to identify evidence the claim that I am me. They could be used in other contexts too, but I don't think it's the right approach to tell everyone you must use this when there could be alternative offerings which are interoperable to do it. So I don't think culturally we're at a place where we can tell Australians they have to use something to prove who they are, but I do think we are at a place we should be giving them choices and helping people provide those choices now.
I think from my perspective, it's also a question of the CDR doesn't rely on digital identity in order to for action initiation to become functional. It will be possible with or without it. And I think that what it will do is really push and drive and force a movement forward in creating, I think what Scott's kind of talking about with a digital identity framework where you're able to have providers offer services. And it might be that this is one which is established by government, or it might be one that's established by private industry, or it might be a mixed system or something like that. But I do think that this is providing more of that impetus to push this forward. And as Scott said earlier, it's not just, this is a positive reason to be bringing this in. This is a way that consumers will really kind of interact with and really resonate with, and which will really push them to want this more and more and more. Just to be able to get the best out of the services that they're able to access.
Thanks both. Got a really good question here, Matt from FData. Great to have you here, Matt. So if the existing business processes and infrastructure on the action side for account switching are not there yet, will we ever see these use cases materialize if there isn't legislation or some sort of mandating of APIs? So what incentives are there really for data holders as action service providers to actually create this and this sort of API infrastructure to facilitate it without that happening? It's a bit of a tricky one, but I suppose it's just this, concept of there's some sort of, probably action service providers need to take some action for these, these use cases to actually materialize. And are they just going to do it out of the goodness of their heart, or does that need to be mandated, I suppose? Maybe Darcy or others, if you have any comments on that.
I'm happy to have a stab to begin with to make sure I understand the question. So I think that action initiation, what we're talking about here, is actually a big opportunity for a lot of service providers as well, because being able to have people more easily sign up with you is a big benefit for those who are competitive. So I think that action initiation is going to be mandating some people are going to be providing services, but there is the opportunity for people to voluntarily join into the system. And I would be very interested in actually seeing how many people are seeing this as a commercial opportunity because they are banking on themselves being able to offer the best service and being able to kind of make the most of this streamlined new process, which is being kind of legislated and enabled for them to be utilizing. But I hope that answers the question. But if anyone else wants to jump in, that'd be good.
Okay, I'll jump in then. If the government designates that a particular action needs to be enabled, then that's your mandate. The government will be consulting before it would do such a thing, and it will work out, is that actually possible? Or, for example, actually that can't be done without state laws changing as well. But when it comes to an individual service provider saying, well, I'm not going to do that, even though the law says that I must do that, that's a very interesting sort of business approach to take. There will be a lot of work put into place to make sure that these things can be done, and hopefully existing infrastructure can be used. But quite frankly, if our government decides that the Australian people need to have something enabled for them, and they have taken into account all the costs and benefits, you know, we're all Australians and we have to follow the law if that's the case. So there could be a mandate, but the mandate could only really be applied once we know the pathway for putting that mandate into, for actually obeying that mandate.
Just another question, kind of grouping a couple here, but it was sort of questions around, particularly with the switching use case. How does that interact with, or how would that not be inconsistent with requirements around other, you know, financial services law requirements, particularly around financial advice, as well as the design and distribution obligations, particularly like target market determinations? Sort of how does the service provider ensure that they're still complying with that when, you know, accounts might be being opened through this sort of streamlined mechanism?
I'm going to jump in first there because I'm just going back to my analogy. And sorry, guys, I'm going to shut up after this. That we find every time we apply CDR to a new sector, it shines a light on, quite frankly, some of the lack of technological neutrality of regulation already in that sector. But the regulation still applies. CDR does not try and regulate every sector for the services underneath. It would go mad if it tried. That's a privilege that the narrowness of the British system grants it. It can just deal with account information services. So yeah, what do you know? The real law applies underneath, because it does if you did this in analog world. Now, does that mean that when we put it into place, we need to carefully look at, could this be done in a better way? Absolutely. And payments is a good example of that. But that's the regulatory infrastructure we have to consider just as much the technological infrastructure when we're applying this instruction layer to an action in a regulated sector. I'm going on mute now, guys. So you've got to answer all the rest of the questions yourself.
And just the point I'll make there is that, you know, the broader regulatory framework outside the CDR is still moves along, moves ahead, is reviewed, is updated, is amended. You know, we've just had the quality advice review. We'll probably have, you know, consultation on the payments licensing framework in the next year. All these things, you know, interact with and relate to what's happening now with action initiation. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to sort of, you know, consider that and ensure Treasury and the government are aware of that, and lining these up and making sure they're as consistent as possible. And there's tech neutrality, as Scott mentioned. So I think that's something, yeah, we definitely, through the quality advice review, put in a submission and tried to make those points as well, that, you know, the world's sort of moving on. Obviously, robo-advice and digital advice has been, you know, something that's been developing, you know, for some time, but it might even, you know, evolve again through CDR action initiation. Just a final one, and this I'll use Scott's analogy to frame it. But a few questions around maybe lack of individual consumer awareness of what the CDR is, how they can get involved, and also maybe consumers maybe being scared of it, not sure what it is, or you know, the risks that might be involved. So how do we sort of get people from, you know, get them off the sand and into the water? There were some, you know, recommendations in the recent statutory review around, you know, incentivizing innovative use cases, you know, maybe some campaigns to sort of inform consumers a bit more. Any thoughts from the broader group about the best way to, build that awareness? Do people need to know what the CDR is, or is it just these things will happen naturally?
I'll throw my thoughts in, Nick, and thanks to Scott and Darcy for answering all your previous questions. So yeah, just back to our, you know, testing we've done with customers. No, there hasn't been a lot of awareness around CDR and open banking, etc. But my view is really that the customers don't need to know what CDR as such is. It's actually the value you're trying to deliver through CDR. So I think for me, CDR really takes a back seat, and what you're always talking to your customer about is the value they'll get out of whatever the product, service or interaction they're having with your brand is. So that's my personal view. And yeah, we've seen that there isn't a huge amount of awareness around the concept of CDR from a consumer perspective. throw to the others on the.
Yeah, I think, Claire, we've had a similar experience. I mean, I think we've done a number of use case development sort of workshops and pieces of work, and a number of those have involved, you know, consumer testing, and really it comes down to, you know, the initial understanding of CDR might be negligible, but once it's really about the use case that you're bringing to life for them and the experience that they're getting, and they don't care if it's CDR powered or, you know, they probably wouldn't have cared if it was screen scraping in the background, you know, which we hope might go away. But, you know, I think that it's really just about that experience that you bring to life, and as a positive or a negative one, what the CDR thing, you say that's powered by CDR, it's kind of, well, great, but it's not really the important piece. But I mean, for me personally, I would like to see more understanding of it, but I think that'll happen over time as those use cases come to life, more so than needing anything more specific or sort of holistic from an education perspective.
I think the one final thing which is possibly worth mentioning is also that the CDR protections apply regardless of whether the consumer understands that they're being protected or not. So consent is a major part of CDR, but so is the other protections that are put in place, like the need for accreditation and like the need for, you know, being regulated by the ACCC. And so consumer understanding, I think, is an important piece. It's a very important piece. But so is the kind of underlying fundamental protections that are kind of also at the core of CDR, as well as consent.
I agree totally with what everyone has said. It doesn't matter if you know what the red and yellow flags are. The fun part is the swimming part. And so that's how people understand that they should be swimming here, because they like the swimming.
Yeah, it's a great way to wrap it up. I think we run slightly over time, but I'll just make a final comment. If you want to find out more about action initiation and the CDR, please do reach out to Darcy, Jill, and the team at Editree. They can run through their technical solutions and explore potential use cases with you. Definitely, they're incredibly passionate about the CDR and are, yeah, keen to have those conversations. We'll send through a follow-up email to everyone that's been involved with their contact details. I think Darcy and I might endeavour to go through some of the extensive Q&A we've received and reach out to anyone we can identify and give you a bit of an answer or have a chat about it. But once again, thank you to all the panelists. Been a fantastic session. Very much appreciate it. And thank you everyone watching for your time today.